Good evening, everyone. My name is Jiza Page, and I am the chair of the Zoning Committee. And I'm joined here today with my colleague, Councilmember Shannon Hardin. And I would also like everyone to know that all of the members of council are also members of the Zoning Committee. I would like to call to order tonight's hearing on the Short North Special Area Parking Proposal. And again, I welcome you all for coming. Councilmember Shannon Hardin is the chair of the Department of Public Service and Transportation. And as you can see on the agenda, Councilmember Hardin will first outline the purpose of this hearing. After he speaks, you will hear from Amanda Ford, Parking Services Coordinator, and Dan Blushsmith, Transportation Planning Engineer, who are both with the Department of Public Service. You will then hear from Mark Lundeen, Administrator, and Kevin Wheeler, Planning Administrator, from the Department of Development. And our final speaker will be Chris Prezzuti, Chief Zoning Official with the Department of Building and Zoning Services. Councilmember Hardin and I will ask a few questions, and then we will conclude with public comment. If you are interested in offering public comment, please fill out a speaker slip and submit it to staff. And again, those speaker slips are back at the table as you enter into the door. And to allow for ample speakers, we ask that comments be limited to 3 minutes. Now, I hand this over to Councilmember Hardin.
Thank you, Councilmember Page, for your leadership of the Zoning Committee. This is a joint hearing of both the Zoning Committee and the Public Service and Transportation Committee. And thank you all for being here this evening on a wet and not so cold evening as we've experienced in the last couple of days. But your time and your energy and your effort and your engagement this evening is certainly appreciated by the folks up here and by the City of Columbus. The purpose of tonight's hearing is to review the plans for the Short North Special Parking Area and hear feedback from residents. Before we hear the proposal, I want to note 2 pieces. First, this proposal is being brought forward because of a recommendation that came from the Short North Parking Study. In 2014, residents and businesses wanted a parking study completed in the Short North because parking had become a challenge with the growth of residential and commercial development. City Council commissioned the study and hired Nelson Nygaard to develop a comprehensive approach to parking management. The final report was issued in 2015 and provided key recommendations to effectively manage the existing parking supply and future development. The special parking area is not the only component of the study. For the past year, public service staff and community stakeholder groups have been meeting to discuss solutions and the implementation of the special parking area, residential permit parking, parking meters, rate adjustments, employee parking options, and technology needs. The proposal we will hear tonight will not solve everything, but is an important piece to make sure that the development in the Short North will be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. With that, I will turn the briefing over to, I think, Amanda Ford for a presentation on the special area parking proposal. Amanda.
And I actually asked Amanda for a second. I would like to welcome our council colleague, Councilmember Michael Santiano, who has joined us this evening as well, and thank him for joining us. Amanda.
Thank you, Councilmember Page, Councilmember Hardin. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to be here tonight to present the special parking area. This is a process we've been working on internally for about the past 15 months, meeting quite often to talk about existing current parking variances that have been issued in the Short North, reviewing research from other cities, and trying to determine what will work best for the Short North parking area. So quickly tonight, we're going to just recap the recommendations from the Short North study. We'll review previous variances that have been issued. We'll share with you some helpful data and reviewing all those parking variances. We'll discuss specifics of the Short North Special Parking Area, review the proposed In-Lieu process that we're talking about tonight. We'll share benefits to both the community and developers. We'll cover our outreach efforts. And finally, I want to talk briefly about residential permit parking. I know that tends to be, most of the questions that I receive are about permit parking, maybe not so much specific to the special parking area. So I want to make sure we address a little bit of the challenges that we're faced with permit parking and that we're moving forward with a proposal. The Short North Parking Study was completed in 2015 at the request of residents and businesses of the Short North to manage parking. So 5 key recommendations came from the study. 1, enhance economic development and vitality. And they encourage this through the use of demand-based pricing. We know that the meter rates are fairly cheap along High Street and in the short north, and adjusting those appropriately to encourage turnover. Creating employee parking options. We know a lot of the long-term parkers on the streets are employees, so we need safe, reliable options for employees to help encourage them to park in other locations. And maximize the on-street capacity. Most of our parking spaces are 23 feet in length. They recommend reducing those to 20, and that's something that we started doing prior to the parking study being finalized. Protecting residential neighborhoods. Obviously, permit parking is one of the key recommendations that came out of the study. They recommend larger zones so that we're not pushing the parking problem from one street to another. Provide accessible parking as part of a multimodal transportation system. Obviously, improving pedestrian facilities, bike facility, and transit programs. A lot of the pedestrian and bicycle things will be touched with the streetscape project that'll be going through the short north. We know that CODA is obviously working on improving transit throughout the city. We have C-Bus. They play a huge role in moving people throughout the short north and trying to encourage other options. And finally, financially sustainable parking. Obviously, this includes part of our technology improvements that we need to look at with kiosks, pay by cell, which is something that we'll look at implementing first in the short north and moving that citywide. And then the license plate reader technology and for enforcement. We know with residential permit parking, enforcement is the key to make it successful. And then finally, creating the realistic zoning requirements, and that's where this comes in tonight with the special parking area. As part of the special parking area, they want you to create an administrative process to handle parking deficiencies. Right now, the BZA process is fairly lengthy, and we want to, it's not about making the process easier, but having a more consistent way to handle parking deficiencies. Establish appropriate parking requirements. Establish an in-lieu fee that is paid when developers are unable to meet the parking requirements, and to continue overbuilding of parking where sites permit. The existing conditions in the short north, I've asked Kevin Wheeler to talk a little bit about just the existing parking and parking requirements in the short north.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Right now, there are sort of two scenarios at play in the short north in terms of parking requirements. For all of High Street, the parking requirements that the city has in the zoning code are the same requirements that we have on Sawmill Road, Hamilton Road. It's the citywide number. And those are built on a sort of suburban standard. In certain portions of Summit and Fourth, commercial and office uses fall within what's called the urban commercial overlay, and that overlay brings with it certain parking reductions. They reduce that base rate that applies citywide by 25% in the case of larger restaurants, and up to 50% in the case of other uses. So those are what currently is in place in the way of parking requirements. Because all of the short north, as most, in fact, of the 1950s city boundaries, the older city, was built before the prevalence of cars, those citywide rates don't work very well. And that puts us in this position of every time someone wants to do something with an original contributing building, they're faced with a parking issue. How do you provide parking? And that means that every time there's an individual proposal, we're sort of asking the question, well, what's an appropriate way to handle parking? The Italian Village Commission, the Victorian Village Commission, these commissions, which are staffed in the Development Department, make recommendations to either the BZA, the Board of Zoning Adjustment, or City Council regarding parking variances. They don't decide them, but they make recommendations. And I think one of the things that they struggle with is, they're not traffic engineers, and they're not always feeling like they're equipped to deal with some of these variance requests, because they can be pretty significant. And as you're going to hear later on tonight, this is an attempt to kind of provide a more consistent way to handle these variances as opposed to case-by-case basis. One of the things that drove this discussion was the realization that over time, the cumulative impact of lots and lots of restaurants and bars in particular, and those are some of our highest parking demand uses, has an impact on the neighborhood more broadly. It can strain parking, particularly at key points of times of the week and day, and in key areas. And that's one of the reasons that we've worked to with some of the developers to establish shared parking agreements in what are emerging as new garages. And that's one of the things that's a little slow to take off because people don't know where they're at and all that sort of thing. But we have established a fair number of spaces, and I think it's an 800-space garage on Goodale just to the north. I think if we can just put up a couple signs. I drove past it yesterday on my way home, and the sign said 672 spaces are available there. So that's part of the solution, and then we'll talk more about the rest of it.
Thank you.
As part of our process, we reviewed all the parking reduction variances for projects that were approved by the Columbus Board of Zoning Adjustment and the Columbus City Council from 2011 until 2015. I'll note that generally a parking deficiency is created any time there's new construction that cannot satisfy the required number of parking spaces, or existing properties where there's a change of use. We are going from one type of use to another that requires more parking spaces, and those spaces cannot be provided. That process, as Kevin mentioned, is typically 3 months to 4 months long, requires visits to the commission, requires a recommendation from the commission, and ultimately is heard by either the City Council or Board of Zoning Adjustment. Let's go to the map. The map is very revealing. This is the general area, and each dot represents one of the parking variance applications that was approved. Noting on the map, those, I'm not sure how good the resolution is, but those projects that are in yellow are residential projects. Let me see here. And those in red are commercial projects. Those in gray were mixed use with some combination of commercial and residential. The number inside that number, inside that circle, represents the number of parking spaces that were varied as part of that process. After we accumulated this data, we went back to those very same applications. There were 65 of those projects that needed variances. Those variances, by the way, in the aggregate, waived 2,090 parking spaces. And of course, I want to be very clear that that is based on the suburban parking requirements. Those deficiencies ranged from 1 parking space deficiency to several hundred parking spaces per project. We took a look at the same applications, those 65 parking space reduction variances for projects, and applied the proposed new parking requirements and the proposed administrative provisions for off-site parking under same ownership within 750 feet of the use, and special consideration also given to institutional uses such as religious facilities and nursing homes. After we did that, only 35 of those projects, next slide, oops. Yeah, oh, there we go. Sorry, let's go back to that middle slide again. I forgot to mention that the boundaries that we reviewed this under were, the north boundary is Fifth Avenue, south is 670. The west would be the first right-of-way that is east of Neal Avenue, and to the east would be the railroad tracks consistent with the east boundary of Italian Village Commission. The proposed parking that we're proposing under this process would be to cut in half parking requirements for residential, which is consistent with the commercial overlays that we've established throughout the city, which, by the way, the Short North was the model for those, even though the commercial overlay is not applied to the Short North. We would also reduce the number of parking spaces for residential uses. For multifamily, that would be 3 units and above, from 2 spaces per unit to 1 space per unit. And we would provide an exemption, no parking required for art galleries, for single unit dwellings, and for retail spaces having 25% or less square feet. Now going to the next slide. We have only 35 of those original projects of the original 65 still were deficient parking, substantially less. Those projects were still deficient a total of 541 parking spaces by applying the new parking requirements. Under this proposal, even if we apply only the lower commercial fee to those 541 deficient spaces, it would have generated $5,410,000 in in-lieu fees that would be used for this process to improve these parking and circulation conditions in the Short North. And so just to reiterate, under this proposal, there would no longer be parking variances. Instead, it would be the in-lieu pay process after applying the reduced parking requirements. A lot of those same projects, especially the new build projects that typically do go through the variance process, also have variances to height, building, and parking setbacks. Those would still be required. Those would still go to City Council and BZA and still require recommendation from the Area Commission. But it would be the parking reduction variances that would be handled through this new process.
Thank you, Chris. Obviously, these are things that would be changes made to the city code. So as part of 33-1251, the other sections of this code would just provide the Director of Public Service the ability to create rules and regs, which is where the In-Lieu process comes in. It creates a process for review and determination of In-Lieu fees. So we've made it very clear in the rules and regs that we will evaluate the fees and determine if they need to be increased, lowered, and determine that those would go into effect every July 1st. So we want to be transparent about when the fees would change if we opted to make any changes in those fees. And then obviously it creates a short north special parking fund. So we have that codified in the code that we're creating this fund specific for the fees to go into. So next we want to talk a little bit about the current variance process so that you can kind of compare the current process to what the proposed process is. Dan?
Yes, and to explain our current process, as Kevin had mentioned, it is basically a case-by-case basis. And looking at the examples over the last few years and being in the thick of this, there's always a lot of things to look at with each application. But just to explain the current process, with any variance request that comes into the Building and Zoning Services Department, that's it either goes through the process through to City Council or to the Board of Zoning Adjustment. Now, as part of that, there's some significant inputs that are part of that. One is the input from the Review Commission, being Italian Village Commission or Victorian Village Commission. But also another important element of that is the staff recommendation, and that the Department of Public Service weighs in heavily on that staff recommendation. And so under the current process, each new application that comes in, as you've seen with some of the projects that have been built, nearly every project has required some kind of parking variance. And so we've been charged over the last few years of looking at those and either negotiating with that applicant to provide the appropriate parking or finding ways to mitigate that through some form of shared parking agreement or some kind of other means. So there's a lot of give and take, but there's not a lot of things that are going to happen after a variance is granted. Once a variance is granted, it's granted by either City Council or by the Board of Zoning Adjustment. So with the development that's continuing to occur and the increased pressure for there to be a parking and transportation solution, the potential to have in-lieu fees paid when parking deficiencies are there, that can potentially lead to other alternate transportation solutions.
So he's talked about what the current process looks like. Now I'll talk a little bit about what the new process could potentially look like. So obviously we know parking variances will no longer be issued, but we did set up some maximum thresholds that we felt required some additional review. So I'll get to those in a second. Parking variances will no longer require BZA or City Council approval. So all applications will go to BZS to verify the parking deficiency. So once that deficiency is confirmed, they'll notify traffic management of the deficiency and will calculate the appropriate fees. So the fees that we've set up were on the residential side. If you're deficient one space, you'll pay $20,000 per space. On the non-residential, $10,000 per space. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why such a discrepancy between the two, why the residential is so important and why it should cost more. We know it has a longer term impact on the neighborhood. So if you're building more condos and apartments, ideally we want you to provide that parking because we know you've got to accommodate those folks for 12, 15 hours a day, sometimes longer on the weekend. So we know how critical that is to the neighborhood. If the parking deficiency is greater than the maximum thresholds allowable, the applicant then must go back to the review commission and get a letter of recommendation. So we feel it's important to not totally take out that public input, but when we have we're setting thresholds for a specific reason, we want it to go back to the neighborhood and to get their input. At that point, once we receive a recommendation from the review commission, our internal committee, which is the folks here sitting at this table who have been working on this, will gather back around, we'll review all the information, we'll look at the input from the community group and determine what we think is most appropriate. We'll make a recommendation to the traffic management administrator, and then he will either deny or approve as we see fit. So the maximum thresholds allowable. What we did was we tried to set some bound for if you have a project that has a lot of financial backing, the last thing we want to see them do is if they're deficient 100 spaces, be able to pay their way out of 100 spaces. I mean, we think about the long-term impact of that on a neighborhood could be impossible to recover from. So we felt it was important to set some thresholds in there. So the parking deficiency has to be greater than 25% and 15 parking spaces on the residential side. And the non-residential has to be greater than the total percent required and 30 parking spaces. It's a one-time payment, and it'll be due prior to any zoning clearance or approvals from traffic management. So they'll have to pay before they can move their project forward. And we do have a special review, I think as Chris had mentioned earlier, as it relates to cultural, institutional, or affordable housing. We felt that those did require an additional look to determine what the appropriate requirements may be. So the administrator will have the option to either could reduce the fees or stick with the fees the way they are, or change the parking requirements for a special use like that. The special parking fund, the benefit of this, the money stays in the district. So it's not going to the city or anything like that for our use, but it's going to stay in the district, and it's written very specific that it has to be spent on parking and mobility related items. So this could be more shared parking agreements for sites who could overbuild parking, managing the existing parking, and that doesn't mean paying for enforcement officers. I know that's a question that came up in an email that won't be paying salaries or anything like that. Looking at promoting alternative forms of transportation, we know this is key to getting people moving around the short north, is encouraging the use of C-Bus, CODA, COGO, and all the different options that we have here. So we think that that's important to try to encourage those programs and help where we can. And obviously the employee parking program, we've got to find employees reasonable parking that's safe, secure, and ideally get them off the residential streets. They're longer-term parkers, but we have to find some good options for them, and that may be subsidizing their parking and using C-Bus as a way to get them to and from their place of business. Some of the benefits to the community under this new proposal: the in-lieu fees stay in the district. The review commissions will no longer have to choose between development and parking. As Kevin talked about, they're often not equipped to handle those requests and would rather have a more consistent way to handle those deficiencies. The process encourages developers to provide the parking. If you're building a residential building and you know you have to pay $20,000 a spot, you got to think about that in your overall budget for the project itself. It provides a consistent process to handle these deficiencies. Will enable alternative transportation solutions through, maybe it's subsidizing C-Bus a little bit to maybe get it to go later so we can get folks around, some options like that, and it helps establish collaborative parking programs. The benefits to the developers and the businesses, I've asked Mark Lundeen out of our development group to talk a little bit about that.
Appreciate the time to be here. We did spend a lot of time talking about all these issues and are trying to balance something that's really complex and has a lot of different impacts. And I think, the biggest thing that I would say out of it is this is going to provide certainty to everyone. So on the resident side, instead of this variance process that, again, is a case-by-case basis, you have concrete requirements that are going to be met. If they're not met, then a significant fee is going to be paid to, only up to a certain point to mitigate that lack of providing the parking. So everyone here, I think, in the room would rather the new development or rehab is just providing the parking that's required for their project, right? We would rather collect $0 and never have this issue. But for those situations where it's just infeasible or in some way very difficult to provide that parking, we need to collect an amount of money that can offset it in the form of other transit investments. So as I looked at it as an economic development administrator for the businesses, I think the first thing that's important is trying to insulate small business from an impact here. So we do have a 2,500 square foot provision that they're exempt if they're smaller than 2,500 square feet. So we're trying to reduce the impact on small business. It also provides a predictable, stable process that everyone knows what the rules are going to be as they go into a project. So if you're a developer or a business and you want to do a new project, you know exactly what the requirements are going to be, and you know how much the fees in lieu of are going to cost on a yearly basis. It speeds up the process in which they can get an approval because of the lack of a variance and, you know, the hearings with the commission and BZA or council. And then, you know, it also allows any fees that are captured to be directly invested back in the way that the neighborhood feels can most benefit the transportation within the neighborhood. So again, we think this provides predictability for everyone. It's a clear line on what needs to be provided in new development or a rehab situation. And, you know, in the event that they can't meet the parking, it provides the community with the resources to mitigate that in an effective way.
Thank you, Mark. Next, some of the outreach efforts that we've done. For the past year, I've been meeting with the Short North Working Group. It's made up for representatives from the Short North Civic, the Italian Village Society, both commissions, Denison Place, Harrison West. The key partner in that is the Short North Alliance. You know, so we have representation from the businesses sitting at the table as we're having these discussions. We met with key developers and zoning attorneys that do most of the key development in the Short North, and we sat down with them and we presented this proposal to them. Some liked it, some didn't. You know, it was, for the most part, the reviews were positive. I think there was some concern over the fees, but for the most part, I think they get it, that they understand they need to be part of the solution. Building Services Review Committee, we're required to meet with them. Italian Village Commission, both Victorian Village Commission issued letters of support for the proposal. We met with the Italian Village Society just to talk through some of the concerns that they had, and then the Development Commission meeting. And I just want to comment, I know the Development Commission meeting was tough. There were a lot of people there and a lot of people who had intended on speaking and not being given the opportunity. So my apologies for that happening. That was, I think, a little tough for all of us to take that night. So Chris and I did our best to stick around and answer as many questions as we could because we understood that people were upset, and rightfully so. So the next piece of this, there's two critical recommendations that came out of the parking study. Obviously, creating the special parking area and residential permit parking. So overall, the study recommended that we create larger zones so that we're not pushing the parking problem from one street to the next. Reduce the number of parking restrictions and make the zones more consistent. Right now, I think they identified like 29 different parking restrictions in the Short North, which make it often confusing to understand where you can and can't park. Allow some paid parking in the permit zones with a posted restriction, but obviously the permit holders would not be held to those restrictions or have to pay to park on the street, and then pricing the streets appropriately to create turnover. So here's a map of what residential permit parking looks like currently in the Short North. So it's kind of sporadic, it's a little spread out. Every area has a different restriction. So it's not consistent at all. So the working group that I've been meeting with for the past year, we spent a lot of time talking kind of just about this map and creating more consistency. You know, is there one set restriction that works across the district? And how do we go about making that work? So that's what that's what it looks like now. This is what they proposed in the parking study, if you haven't seen the map. I'm sure it's a little hard to see the different color variations in the map, but they actually recommend 4 large parking zones. And while it looks great on paper, those are big zones. So literally, if you live all the way up to 7th, you could drive all the way down to the Goodale area and park. It's a little large for what we felt was appropriate, so we're still trying to determine what are those appropriate boundaries and how can we make it work best for the residents without giving too much freedom to park within the district. The last thing we want to do is somebody who probably maybe could walk or use the C bus to get to restaurants. We don't want to encourage residents to go park in front of somebody else's house. So what are the right boundaries for permit parking? The next thing, the parking study recommended that we start pricing some of these streets. Now, along with that comes a lot of challenges, because how do what's the appropriate restriction? What's the proper pricing of the street to create the turnover that you're going to need to park on your street? So the red zone, they recommend at a higher price. It's priced during the day and the evening time. The yellow, orange area, they're recommending that that's paid parking in the evening hours and not during the day, that it should be free. And they base this all on the demand of them out looking at the streets during the daytime hours and the evening hours. And then they're recommending that the blue area be free. So ideally, they're saying, we should be around $1.50 an hour. Well, we know the parking garages are $2 an hour. So that doesn't really encourage folks to go to the garage. It just encourages more people to circle the street trying to find the most reasonably priced parking. So we know we've got some work to do with the garages to work together on how do we solve this issue of pricing. Because ideally, we want everybody parking in the garage first, and then if there's overflow, that spreads out through the streets. Ideally, that's the way it should work. But right now, the streets are so much cheaper, the streets fill up, and then the overflow go into the parking garages. So it kind of works backwards right now. So how do we build that relationship with the garages to say, hey, work with us? And we have shared parking agreements with these garages. So we got to get them to the table and sit down and say, this is what we need. We need you to work with us, but we also know that we have to price those streets appropriately. So we could be looking at meter rate increases to help to get that 85% occupancy. That's what they tell us in the parking world, that that's kind of the sweet spot for parking, and that you should have one available space at all times on every block. So that's what we're trying to create. So it's going to take some work. It gets very complex when you start, getting down into the weeds of that. With adding paved streets, obviously, the option of kiosks. Some people like the idea, others don't. Kiosks have come a long way. They're not nearly as ugly and bulky and take up as much space as they used to, but nobody wants one in front of their house either. So how do we address that issue? We know corner locations are going to feed the most streets, and that's probably an option. But if your house is on the corner, you're not going to be happy with us when we put a kiosk out there. So how do we address that issue? We know pay-by-sell is a great option, and ideally, we want to encourage people to use the pay-by-sell. So if we can strategically place kiosks to help minimize that, that's helpful, but we know we still have to put some kiosks out there. And we also need to address the issue of ADA parking. So along with paved streets comes more ADA parking, which is a good thing. But what happens when your street's paved now? So not only do we have a kiosk on your street, and now we have ADA parking spaces that you can't park in because you don't have a placard. So when you start digging into the weeds of how you add some of this together, it gets really complex. So I know a lot of folks have looked back and said, why isn't this moving forward? But I think everybody on the working group would tell you it gets really complicated, and when you try to start thinking about a consistent plan across the Short North. So obviously boundaries is something that we're trying to get those finalized to what we think is reasonable before we present it to the neighborhoods. The on-street restriction is another key thing, is what's the ideal restriction? I know a lot of folks come to me and say, I want a 24/7 restriction on our street. Well, that's great, and I don't blame you, but is that what's best for the neighborhood as a whole? So that's the way we're looking, and we're trying to look at an overarching approach of what's in the best interest of the neighborhood. If we restrict all the side streets just to residents, what does that do to the businesses? What makes your neighborhood so great? It's a good mix of businesses, retail, residential. So how do you balance that out so that maybe not everybody's needs are exactly met, but there's some compromise there? Obviously, the pricing of the streets. We know we've got some tough times coming with looking at what is the appropriate rate on the street so that we work with those garages and get folks parking in those garages. Visitor passes. That's a hot topic. We know right now everybody gets one visitor pass, but we're looking at potentially another approach to that because with enforcement, we need license plates to help do the enforcement, which I'll talk on briefly in a minute. But so we're probably going to change the way we do visitor passes. Employee options, as I spoke about earlier. The key thing is we've got to find options for employees before we implement the permit parking, because the last thing we want to do is run all the employees out. They're vital to the success of the neighborhood. Technology improvements, we've got kiosks, we've got pay-by-cell, and license plate reader technology. That was one of the key things that they talked about in enforcement in the parking study, is if you want to effectively enforce it, use license plate readers. We got a lot of ground to cover in the short north for enforcement. So if everybody's parking permit is tied to their license plate, if every visitor permit is tied to a license plate, the kiosk and the pay-by-cell is all tied to your license plate, it makes it a lot easier for us to drive down the street enforcing it. The technology's pretty cool. Obviously, when we get to that point, we'll definitely do some demos with it, but you have 2 little cameras on the back of the car, they drive down the street, and if your license plate is in the database, you're good. It's when your license plate is not in the database. You've either not paid to be on the street, so it's clear, the violations are a lot clearer. So it'll be a much more efficient and effective way to actually enforce permit parking. I know that's one of the complaints I get a lot now is there's not a whole lot of enforcement. Well, this is a way to help make it easier and get people following the posted restrictions on the street. So we know enforcement is a key piece to this. So kind of our next steps is, and my apologies on the first thing I should have put was obviously we'll look at the feedback we get tonight. We'll take that back to the table, review that, and determine if we need to make changes. And if so, that's something that we'll go back to council with and talk about what our next steps will be. But ideally, if there's no changes that need to be made, we'll send the legislation to council and let them have a first reading on that. Start presenting permit parking plans. Ideally, our goal is to have that out in March or April. We're trying to finalize things so that we have a solid plan to take out and make sure that everybody has an opportunity for input. The input that's going to be required for permit parking will be pretty substantial because we realize that impacts every single property owner in the short north. So there will definitely probably be lots of meetings here and around the district asking people to come in and give their feedback on permit parking. Loading zones and valet zones, and I think I forgot to mention that earlier, that's one of the recommendations that also came out is we need shared loading and valet zones. But it sounds like this is something we're going to work on through the Smart Columbus grant that we received. Initially, they were looking at downtown for some scheduled loading zones, but it looks like they want to focus on the short north, which is a good thing. So if we can help combine some of those loading zones and get maybe the trucks on a schedule for loading and unloading, that might be a little more beneficial, and hopefully we won't have them parking in the middle of High Street, unloading during the daytime hours. They also recommended some parking sign changes using more of like a bar graph and creative. We love the idea. We submitted the paperwork to do an experiment, and it was denied because the feds are requiring some human factor testing that goes along with that. So we're going to have to contract with a university and see if we can get them to do some testing before we can change the signage. And then we'll continue working through the other recommendations in the study. We know there's several, and this was never meant to be implemented in a month, in a year. It was supposed to be a long-term process, so that's why we kind of decided to tackle the 2 biggest pieces first. Permit parking and the special parking area. We know they're going to be the toughest to swallow. There's going to require change. We know not everybody's going to be happy, but we're going to do our best to try to approach parking in a way that will work for everybody. So I just ask that you try to be patient with us, and when we invite you out to the public meetings about permit parking, definitely be involved because we want to hear your input, and we'll get things moving forward. So we'll turn it over to the council members to see if they have questions. And I also put an email address up here that if you do have questions after tonight, feel free to email. I respond to this email address. So I figure this is easier than trying to remember my name. So feel free to email me with questions.
Thank you, Amanda and team. This is a lot of information that was just presented, and I think it's reflective of the 2 years or so of work, the year of community engagement to get us to this step. As part of the recommendations that came out of the Nelson Nygaard study, how important is this first step, the variance in lieu piece, to making this process, the entire process work. And can you talk about the importance of getting to consistency in our variance, and taking away the variances in terms of parking, in terms of getting to what that goal was of the parking study?
Well, as I said earlier, obviously, creating the special parking area is a key recommendation out of the study. I think that the consultants quickly realized that there is no consistent way in the past of dealing with these parking variances, and I'm sure these folks are probably better equipped to answer that question, but that was one of the reasons we took it on first, was because of how important it is to the area, and because development's not stopping. It's not slowing down. So the longer we wait to implement this, the less opportunity you have for developers to A, try to meet appropriate parking requirements, but B, you lose any opportunity of holding them accountable by asking them to pay into a fund to help mitigate the issues. So I don't know if you guys want to chime in and.
No, I think, well, I guess I would just say that I think you hit it right on. I mean, right now we have a situation where we have unrealistic parking requirements. Again, I know you keep hearing us say suburban, but if you think about Sawmill Road and Hamilton Road and the empty parking lots that you see in those places, and you say, well, if you're going to apply that standard here, then we all start out with, okay, that doesn't work. So then we have a situation where every individual case is sort of open for debate. And I think that we really benefit by having a more predictable pathway to figuring out what parking requirements are. And we have some allowance to provide less than the code requirement, but that's capped. And even in those instances, there's a requirement that you contribute to a fund to help address the impacts of your project. And those impacts are not just auto-oriented. They're pedestrians, they're people who are bicycling, they're people who are using CODA and C-Bus and things like that. So I think we feel like development's going to continue. It's important for us to all have a manageable and predictable path to making sure that it addresses the impacts that it's bringing to the community.
Yes, and if I could just add, basically, if we would continue not implementing a process like this and development continues, and as it has in the past 8 years or so, as those variance applications continue to come forward, there's decreasing ability for there to be any real mitigation, whether building lots of parking or finding parking somewhere else. So this is giving the city a tool to help to allow continued development and vitality of the neighborhood, and to serve those needs.
How will this affect any proposed plans? Sorry, that was kind of loud. Any proposed plans for development in this area, seeing as we have not passed this yet on council?
We currently have a number of applications in right now for parking reduction variances to primarily to Board of Zoning Adjustment. I'm not sure if we have any pending right now for City Council. Those have standing. So those would be able to continue through that process, even if the special parking area is adopted in the meantime.
And Amanda, you spoke briefly about the review commission. Could you kind of just talk about who will be a part of that commission?
Our internal working group will be that review that if it exceeds the maximum thresholds and has to come back to the city for the internal review, it'll be the 5 of us that will make up that internal review committee. Obviously we worked on the proposal, we understand the background, the intent of it, so I think it's most beneficial to pull all of us back in and allow us to review that and look at, not only the development, the recommendation from the commission, but to look at the overall parking in the area and how that might potentially impact the neighborhoods.
So development is going to continue in the Short North. It's a highly sought area, and we want to encourage that. We also need to, we're at that point where, though, if we don't address the parking issues, it will have a negative effect on the entire community, both business and residential. How did we come up with the two sets, $20,000 and $10,000 for the in-lieu fee? Is that enough to encourage parking spaces to be built? Just kind of talk through how we came up with that.
Sure. Basically, the fee of the $20,000 was generally sought to be something in the range of what structured parking space would be, and perhaps some other folks can chime in here, but that was generally sought to be the idea of what it would cost someone to build a structured parking space, somewhere generally in that range of cost. Now, the differentiation between the residential and commercial was basically due to our knowledge that a residential parking variance has a much more dramatic long-term and permanent impact to the neighborhood. And conversely, a commercial parking variance, while they are subject to more spaces, there can be dual usage of a parking space. Let's say if for a business that's open, a couple different businesses, an office, a restaurant. So in summation, we didn't feel that it was appropriate to assign that same amount for the commercial space. So that would be the $10,000 per space that would be varied. So I don't know if anything else related to that.
The only other thing I'd say is you want any new development to provide the amount of parking spaces that they need for their building, right? And so the fees need to be significant and a detriment in their evaluation as a developer. You want them to be able to provide the parking instead of simply just paying the fee and pushing the issue to someone else. So that's another piece of what went into why it is as high as it is.
And if I can just say, in our research of other cities who have successful programs, in-lieu fee programs, they really range all over the board. Some cities only charge like $2,000 to $3,000 per spot, and some charge $30,000 per spot. So we're really kind of in the middle somewhat of what a lot of other cities do. So we did take a look at that to determine, kind of what approach other cities took.
My last question is about the exemptions. How we have from the exemptions for requiring off-street parking are the art galleries, single unit dwellings, and retail spaces with less than 2,500 square feet. Can you talk about how we came up with those exemptions and how in the special review process you'll deal with things that might just come up and
To start with, the working group that I've been meeting with for the last year who represent the neighborhoods, they really felt it was important to protect art galleries. It's an arts district, and they want to protect that as much as they can. So they really felt it was important to exempt those. And we know that art galleries don't have a huge overall impact on parking. And obviously, the smaller retail shops, they were really big on wanting to keep those. So we felt it was important to exempt those two specifically. I'm sure Kevin or Chris can chime in on.
Yeah, I think those exemptions have the benefit also of really not, frankly, generating a lot of parking demand. So an art gallery, a small retail shop, as distinguished from a restaurant and bar, these are things that, I think most folks would like to see encouraged in this district, and they don't demand a lot of parking. Same with a single-family home. I mean, I don't know that there are that many circumstances where we're going to get an individual single-family home, but this is not intended to be burdensome on individual homeowners. And because that parking demand is fairly insignificant, it's not a real big give in that way. So we feel it's responsive to genuine need, but also it doesn't tip the apple cart.
And if I could add, the single unit dwelling is only intended to be applicable for a single unit on a single lot, not, if you add a carriage house or, just to not be punitive towards someone who's, rebuilding a house or that has a lot that perhaps doesn't have any alley access.
Well, thank you. There are no further questions or comments. We can now move to the public comment section. Again, each speaker will be given 3 minutes. If you have not filled out a speaker slip and wish to comment, please complete a sheet at this time and hand it to a staff member. Again, as Amanda pointed out, we are aware that there were individuals who attended the Development Commission meeting who could not speak. And this is, again, an opportunity to allow for public comment. And if this proposal does go back to the Development Commission, if changes are made, that comment will be considered again as well. So we will begin. Our first speaker is Mr. Daniel Koch. I'm sorry if I pronounced your last name incorrectly. The mic is here. Again, you have 3 minutes, and please state your name again, your address, and any organizations that you may be representing.
Daniel Coe. I own Columbus Ironworks in the Short North and salons at High and Hubbard in the Short North. I'm also a resident at 2nd and High in the Short North. Just my one comment would be about I'm in favor of increasing parking in the Short North. The exemption for the In-Lieu fee of 2,500 square feet, if that's limited to one business, great. But if a developer can come in and develop 20,000 square feet of retail and divide it by 8, for instance, can they be exempted from that In-Lieu fee with that particular type of development? So I want to make sure that that's an individual business and it's not a huge development that can be subdivided. New development into 2,500 square foot segments, because that's not really fair, as an exemption for parking for that kind of development. I also wanted to just comment about the 2005 parking study that was actually done by the neighborhood groups. And one of the things that came out of that was that it was attached to legislation in 2005 that provided money for parking down here, for parking structures. And the Hub Garage, as well as the Puzzuti Garage, got money from the city. And that was a parking TIF that was created from that process. But what has happened for a lot of the new development now coming is that council has granted tax abatement. So that is money that's not going into that fund to create potentially a larger pot of money to build garages that might be needed further north. And I know that not everyone's in favor of garages, but we do have a deficiency of spaces real close to High Street, and that's really acute on Thursday night, Friday, and Saturdays and Sundays as well. So that's what I see from my own individual businesses that I own, that we need to go ahead and we're really strained for parking because we don't have off-street parking. So I appreciate the legislation, though, that you're proposing. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional comments?
I just comment on one factor. Appreciate your comment, and we appreciate your business in the city of Columbus. Relative to new parking, there are 2 new structured garages that the city participated in a public-private partnership. They're going to be built. One's very close to your 2nd Avenue in the White Castle development, and then the Wood Company, we partnered with them to build one in Lincoln and Pearl alleys to the south. So both of them provide, one's 104 public spaces, the White Castle, and the Lincoln and Pearl's 125. And so those are coming online. They're just starting construction right now, so you should see those open in the next year or so.
And in regard to the gentleman's concern about a new construction, for instance, just using it as an example, a 10,000 square foot space being split into 4 2,500 square foot spaces. Under the current proposal, those spaces, each of those 4 would not be required to provide any parking spaces. If there is some rationale or interest in changing that, we'd be happy to talk with you. But as currently proposed, any 2,500 square foot spaces would not require parking, whether they are grouped together in multiple spaces within one building or on separate parcels.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Larry Corey. Again, you have 3 minutes. If you could let us know your name, your address, any organizations you're representing. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Good evening. My name is Larry Corley. I live at 183 East 1st Avenue here in Columbus. I've been talking to Miss Ford here about the parking in the area, and I'll stay to my own side of the fence, which is my parking on my street. We have people coming around the corner from Hamlet, that is permit parking on the street because they don't have permits or they don't want to give a guest pass or whatever the cost. You have the go-karts, they drop off and leave there. This happens all the time. As Mr. Coe mentioned, that we have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, damn near nothing. During the day, we have plenty of time. We got plenty of time. We don't need a permit parking for the daytime. We need it at the bar hours. The brewery, I've talked to a number of their employees. They say they're told to both park on the street. I talked the same thing to the fitness center. They're told to park on the street. I don't get this. You know, I got it in the center of Columbus. We have established old neighborhoods. We have an old neighborhood, but they're building new neighborhood right across the street. Why are not these guys being responsible for their parking and the people that come to their stores or whatever? $2,500 or 10% or 25% of whatever. I mean, that goes into the trinket fund. I mean, you're talking about parking devices. What's that going to do for us? We've got no parking, period, enough. And you know, I don't see anybody taking responsibility. It seems like a fairly simple, straightforward thing. You're going to put in a place over here in Jeffrey Place, which laid around for 500 years without anything happening to it. Now we have more parking. We have less parking than we started when they came. You know, somewhere someone's got to get along with that. And you got to pay attention, in my opinion, to the people on the street. I don't know. How do you work that out? How do you charge me a permit to park during the day and I got to fight with the animals at night? Pardon me. Very direct. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Go ahead. You got something?
Thank you for your yes, that was your spirited response. No, I really do appreciate that, and it will be part of continued conversations as we dive deeper into the permit parking process. And we will look for your input and others as we continue those conversations. So I appreciate that, seriously.
I'll do my best to keep you in my face.
Our next speaker is Mr. Bill Wood.
I will cede my time.
Thank you. Well, not thank you, like we didn't want to hear you, but thank you for letting us know. We now have Richard Jacob. Again, please state your name, your address, and organizations that you represent. Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
My name's Richard Jacob. I live at 61 West 2nd Avenue. I'm here to talk about a number of issues that you brought up. There is so much that you presented tonight, and to say I have 3 minutes to respond to it is almost laughable. And you should be ashamed of yourselves, in my opinion. You're all good people. You're all doing what you think is the right thing. But I look at what's going on in my neighborhood, and I look at the development that's going on there, and I live on West 2nd Avenue, and it's hard to park there now. And in the last year and a half, they've approved over 600 new residences for that area with no additional space. No more roads, and you're going to pay somebody $10,000 or $20,000 for a parking space. And what are you going to do with that money? Put in more roads? No. You're going to figure out what are we going to do to help accommodate the growth in the area, which is good. But for me, my $700,000 house, I can't park in front of it. To park in front of my house now doesn't cost me a nickel. Under your plan, it's going to cost me some money. In addition to the TIF that I'm paying every year. I don't know what the TIF is for, but I'm paying it. So anyway, I look at a lot of the attitudes that I see displayed here, and I think you're absent from the life on the street and from the residents. You don't know what's going on. You ought to live in my world, in my shoes. Come live in my house for a week and try and park and see what goes on and see the garbage that's left on the streets from all the people that are coming in. And the TIF is not cleaning it up. You're making rules and regulations, and you need to make them, and I appreciate that. And you're seeking input, but from my experience over the last year and a half in addressing with City Council and the Board of Zoning and the various commissions, you don't listen to the input. You know what you want to do, and you go forward and you just do it. You're getting disconnected from the people that live here. Then residents make up the neighborhood, and you're killing the neighborhood. We're all for development, but it's got to be responsible. That's what I've got to say.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Amanda, could you go into some of the uses of the special fund, the parking fund, in terms of what it could be used for, taking into account we might not even know some of the different techniques that we could use?
We tried to limit the money has to be spent on something associated with parking and mobility in the neighborhood. But we left it vague enough that we could be somewhat creative to try to help with the parking situation. I don't think we can say exactly what it will be spent on until the time comes. A lot of it will depend on how much money it generates. That will limit our ability probably to do huge significance. I don't think we're going to be, gaining enough money to build a new parking garage in the short north. Obviously, it will never generate that kind of revenue. But we're going to be willing to listen to ideas and suggestions on that. Obviously, with my working group, I think it'll be important to work with those folks and take suggestions and input from them.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Philip Skunza. Can you please state your name, address, and any organizations that you're representing?
Thank you. I am Philip Skunza. I live at 153 Detroit Avenue. I also work in the Short North at the Happy Greek. I was part of the study, the original one, 5 years ago, I think it was. I appreciate the input that they did. I just wonder if the High Street corridor, you guys want to shrink the parking spaces, the parallel parking from 23 to 20 feet, is that what you said? Has anybody thought about maybe changing the parking into head-end parking only, doing away with what I refer to as the suicide lane, and just making a two-way street, which would also slow down the traffic. It would add parking to the street and probably increase revenue for the city too. And then my other question would be, what is the price or the fee they're going to charge residents for these parking permits in these 4 zones?
As far as the actual cost for the residential permit fees, right now they are $25 a piece. The study actually recommended $100 a piece. We did a little bit of research to look at what other cities were charging, and it ranges anywhere from free to San Francisco, I think, charges $127. And I was like, we're not San Francisco. So I don't think that price is justifiable. Within our working group, we talked about $50 per year. Obviously, we're going to be making a significant investment with additional enforcement and the technology required to actually do the enforcement. But ideally, if folks have a garage, we want you parking if you have off-street parking, we want you parking in it. So obviously some people may look at $50 and say, you know what, I can't swing it for the year. Others may say, $50, I'll still keep my garage packed full of stuff and I'll park on the street, so.
Brings me to a point, I unfortunately do not have off-street parking, and that's quite prevalent throughout the neighborhood, being as old as it is.
Absolutely.
So is that fair to them to pay this fee when my neighbor across the street has off-street parking and doesn't have to pay the fee?
Well, they wouldn't have.
Just want to be respectful of your time, make sure you get all your questions out, and then I'll let.
That's fine.
And then my last question would be for businesses that already have the permit parking right now. We are paying $100 for 2 spaces, and that's limited between, I do believe, Russell and Hubbard. Does that fee change for the businesses? Will those permits still be allowed for the businesses? And then one last question. Is there going to be, the permits are getting ready to expire at the end of January. So is there a moratorium on the permits? Do we still need to purchase for this year? Okay.
For this year, yeah. And we're still evaluating what the appropriate price will be. So that'll be part of our rollout in the spring, is to say, yes, for sure, this is the price that we're looking at.
All right, well, thank you for your time, and I appreciate everything you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cleve Johnson, can you please state your name, your address, any organizations that you're representing? Thank you.
Cleve Johnson, 123 Price. I'm a resident since 1980. When I hear you're going to fix a problem by cutting the parking space requirement in half, what I hear is you're going to make it twice as bad. When I hear that you're going to fix the problem by letting people pay for parking spots, what I hear is you're going to let people pay to make things worse. When I get a notice on my front porch saying, show up at this public meeting and give your input about this new parking plan, my neighbor, 87-year-old neighbor, and I show up, and they don't let anybody talk. It sounds like they're solving developers' problems, and they don't really care about residents' problems. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Kelly Allen. Again, I'd like to call Kelly Allen. Well, please let the record reflect that Kelly Allen is not present. Paul Curry. Again, please state your name, address, and any organizations that you're representing.
Hi, my name is Paul Curry. I am at 704 Neal Avenue, and I'm just here as a resident. I live in a single-family house on Neal in Victorian Village with no off-street parking, no garage. And currently, I'm prohibited from purchasing a Victorian Village permit, even though Victorian Village restrictions are on the streets all around me, except for on Neal Avenue, because I think it's because it's a thoroughfare. Will you consider getting rid of that prohibition? Because I'm really kind of stuck with that.
And that's all part of reviewing the boundaries that we're doing right now and making sure that we don't push the parking problem off and that we look at everything. So definitely we're looking at Neal.
Thanks. Is there a place I couldn't see the proposed map? Can I get that online somehow, or?
Yeah, that's what, if you go to our Department of Public Service webpage, there's a link for parking. And if you scroll down at the bottom, there's a Short North, there's one for the special parking area, and then there's a link for the Short North special parking, or the Short North parking study. If you click on the final report on the study page, you'll see the maps that I have. Yep, thank you.
I just wanted to, and one of the questions that Mr. Skunza had about the road diets, I just wanted to make note that our traffic manager is here, Ronaldo. So if you answer that question on the side, just give you an answer to that.
Colleen Renner. Thank you for coming this evening, Colleen. Again, state your name, address, and any organizations you're representing.
My name is Colleen Renner. I live at 15 West Star. I will say that I am glad that you're doing some sort of parking analysis here. I wish that the comment was not made that anything that has already been, asked to be approved will have standing. There's a lot of things that are coming up in development that the neighborhood does not agree with, and I wish it would also be taken into effect with everything you're doing here with parking. I am glad that you're doing something with permits. This is one of the few things in this world that I actually want to pay for, because I'm annoyed by the parking that we experience daily, especially those that do utilize the C-Bus by just parking in front of our house, getting on the C-Bus, taking that for free downtown, and not paying for parking when they do have it available to them. So I hope that you work with those downtown organizations that do supplement C-Bus and encourage their employees to figure out other parking items as well. So lastly, conversation has happened with us of actually marking off the spaces. That is an idea that my friend David Jackson has seen and seems to help in, you talked about 23 to 20. That seems like it would help. Are you going to be marking off parking spaces in the residence areas as well, not only for parking, but also for where you can't park, as sometimes we do see corners that you should not be parking at. People do attempt to park, and there's no repercussions currently. So thank you.
We don't mark residential streets, to mark individual spaces, but this has come up multiple times, so it's something we can definitely have some more conversation about. I know a group that I met with last week had asked, could we at least mark the first and last spot, so to help get those corner clearances in. So it's something that we'll definitely keep talking about.
David Jackson. Thank you, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm David Jackson. I'm with at 895 Dennison Avenue. I live in the neighborhood. I also work in the neighborhood out of the house. And several variations and a few years of negotiation later, I have 2 off-street parking. So I'm very happy with all of that stuff. Picking up on the point that Ms. Renner was making is one of the things that is very common in the neighborhood is what I call the sloppy parking. So what I mean by that is they don't know, am I supposed to be 25 feet from the stop sign or supposed to be 15 feet from the stop sign? So let's make it 35 feet from the stop sign so I can guarantee nobody else can park in this area. And that, okay, you get the drill. So all you need is the one person who's that sloppy parker, and then it cascades for the night. And then what happens to me is because I become the ugly neighbor, because anywhere between 5 and about 40 times a year, I have to have people towed out of the driveway area so I can actually use it in the next coming morning. And in doing so, I'm actually wasting police resources. So one of the suggestions I was going to make is in the striping, think of Neal Avenue and to the, west. There's a lot of striping that has gone on that seems to, just in walking around the neighborhood, seems to improve people to understand, oh, I can park up to the edge of the line, right? So the yellow curbs don't seem to affect people. It's kind of amazing that people can ignore that. But anyway, so maybe that white striping is actually working. And I don't know, some of the folks from Neal and over in that area, if they would comment, that would be helpful. But it is very bad. I mean, how far from the corner do you park? How far from the ADA ramps do you park? How far do those things change and morph over time. So that's one thing. Second thing is, in order to go through and talk about enforcement, you're talking about, are you allowed to park there or not? Did you pay the fee or not, right? This whole business of the inability of some people to understand in their minds how to actually park, especially in a parallel park environment, right? That causes this weird cascade effect. That causes the inability to get out of the alley where she lives. That gets, and how far do you get? So I can't see when I come around Hunter used to be called Alley, Hunter Street into First, those sorts of things. That enforcement, unfortunately, the only recourse as a resident we have to go to is the police. And to me, that is it's a very expensive way to remind somebody of their understanding the parking rules. So those were the two pragmatic approaches I was going to mention.
Thank you. Kathleen Fox. Welcome, Kathleen. Again, if you could please state your name, address, and any organizations representing. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Fox. I live at 1315 Denison Avenue, and I live 1 block outside of the area that's proposed for the special parking area. I wanted to speak in favor of the special parking area, even though I don't live within its boundaries, and just wanted to share with the council members that I think it's a good idea, that I think that having the zoning for parking that is appropriate for an urban area in the code is a good thing. And I think the effort to have a fund to mitigate the impacts is a good thing. In the area I live, there will be a zoning proposal before you, probably at a similar time to this current proposal, that will also reduce parking requirements, but will not provide that mitigation that this proposal of this special parking area will provide for the area a block from where I live. And so I'm really here just to say that I think that this is a good idea. I think it is something that should be looked at in the whole area that's impacted by these development pressures and increasing need to manage transportation and parking and alternatives to use of cars. So I'm hoping that the city will look in the fairly short term at expanding the special parking area boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fox. Amanda, could you speak to how we came up with the boundaries right now? I think we touched on this earlier, but just how we came up with the boundaries.
Yes. Basically, the east boundary is simply the railroad tracks, which is the eastern boundary of Italian Village. The northern boundary was defined to be Fifth Avenue, and that was basically due to the the area north of Fifth Avenue is part of the university overlay, and that is going through a separate parking review and code change process that's being proposed in that area. So that we kept it out of that. The southern boundary is I-670 is the downtown area, which has no parking requirements. And then the western boundary, which was probably the most challenging boundary, is basically everything, or just a line just east of Neal Avenue, roughly. And that was basically, based on looking at the maps that were shown, most of the variances were kind of within the High Street corridors, within a few blocks, of High Street. Going further west of Neal Avenue really didn't seem appropriate to, particularly with the residential parking requirements to be reduced to the one space per dwelling unit. Those areas would still be subject to the 1.5 parking spaces per unit for multifamily and 2 space per unit for single family. So, those are kind of the considerations for the boundaries that we looked at.
If I could add. Also, one of the considerations was just that as you move further west, where there's less opportunity for development, there's less potential to benefit from the fund and the alternatives to parking that are created as well.
You. Just so I won't forget, where can folks who either weren't here this evening and watching this on CTV, or folks who couldn't see the different colors, where can they get a copy of this presentation?
What I can do is I can post it on our website under the special parking area, where the other information is specific to the special parking area. We can post it on there tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Our next speaker is Kevin Coasters. Again, I'm sure you know the drill, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you and good evening. Appreciate the opportunity here. My name is Kevin Kesters. I'm at 122 Wilbur Avenue. I want to thank Amanda personally for what is now 6 pages and a very colorful dialogue of emails over the past month and a half. Obviously, Councilman Hardin, you had mentioned 2 years. This effort's been going on. The mass majority of the landowner here is residential from what I can see on a map. And you've given us or provided us 1 representative from the 12 to 14 different folks that are in that group. And that individual, I just found out her name and what dialogue and effort has been given for us. 2 opportunities for a public meeting, one of which we are permitted and very thankful for speaking. I have a quick statement, I believe, if I can find it, and we can have further dialogue after that if time permits. City of Columbus Council members, the working group, along with 12 or so representatives, have a great responsibility, a challenging responsibility. All of us in this room can agree on one thing today, and that there is a parking concern which we believe can be positively impacted with change. It is understanding and communicating properly that change to get us as much input and eventual buy-in from the majority. Folks you are looking at, I can only presume, are the majority, which would be the permanent residential property owners. These aren't commercial developers sharing in the same struggles as we, the majority, do. However, I ask you, who is it that you have communicated with and who has been in communication with you? Commercial development, who can afford the time and resources toward their best interest. But who represents us, the permanent resident, in our best interest? What you see here in front of you is a face of many individuals. However, we are more than that. We are a community, one in which kept this area intact with sustainable land ownership for many, many years, well beyond our most recent commercial interest. So we ask you to provide us with an opportunity for collaboration. We understand the city has a huge challenge with their responsibility to communicate effectively to the public. Our commercial partners have similar invested interest as we do as an individual property owner. However, what they possess, which we currently do not, is a front to the city for formal influence to change. I'm not sure how we would have this without establishing a committee who is willing to communicate directly with property owners on an ongoing and efficient basis as a liaison to the city. Afford us an opportunity to catch up and permit you an opportunity to be of service to our community. The service you undoubtedly ran on with your campaign and vowed to as an elected council member. We have to, at some point, trust you. You will do for all of us what is in the best interest of the city of Columbus in the thriving Victorian Village and Short North districts. Ask yourself if you can fully explain and understand how and why the fees for developers are 50% less than residential while parking requirements are half. You see, it is my and assumingly our best interest to understand this fully as it will impact us daily. And then what are the unidentifiable consequences to these generated funds who undoubtedly the opportunities for a direct impact in our district becomes extinct and the use of the funds will be used elsewhere due to what our political term as unidentifiable consequences. And I think you guys are very receptive to our comments and to Mr. Coe's comment with the 2,500 square feet. I believe you said, yeah, we'll continue that conversation, but we don't know how you're continuing that conversation. How is that, where's our seat at the table? Because that is truly a concern if a developer, and then it can be voided of all these fees. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cluster. And I appreciate your input up till now, the feedback that you've given. It sounds like you've been in conversation with Amanda and others, and we want that type of participation to continue. We hope that this is not the end of this conversation. This is not the only public hearing that we'll have on these processes. I think we do all see this as a community challenge. In terms of parking in the Short North. And so want to encourage, and I look forward to hearing from you and talking through some of your specific concerns. Amanda, do you have specifics to anything that you had mentioned today?
I know the concern about the working group and having a representative from each area on the working group. And this was a working group that was created with the parking study. So that's why we pulled from that same group, because they were involved with the consultants in the study itself. So they understood kind of what the consultants were working on, the recommendations that came out of the study. So obviously, as permit parking moves forward, like I said, it will require a great deal of community input. So we'll continue going out to the neighborhoods with permit parking once we have our final proposal together. Like I said, I suspect that to be in the spring, hopefully March, April. And so, but that won't be a final.
Well,
So,
in my opinion, the permit parking is so closely related to the In-Lieu process that we should have all of that figured out now. We don't even know concrete how the money is going to be spent, so that money is going to sit there. I understand and appreciate the effort with the map and generating funds of $5 million, but really, how much has been lost to tax abatements? And the 5 bullet points that are in the 2-page summary you sent out in November, a lot of those bullet points that I see are really borne on the responsibility of our city with day-to-day operations, street lighting, signs, mobility issues. It's not something that should be borne and impacted indirectly to the residents by creating a fund after you've given them a tax abatement. Thank you.
And our final speaker this evening is Cleve Ricksecker. Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Cleve Ricksecker. I live at 206 West First Avenue within the parking zone that we're talking about. And I have to ask, what are the odds that 2 people whose name is Cleve would be speaking the same night? I've owned my house for 20 years, no off-street parking. I've been in the neighborhood like Cleve Johnson for 36 years. What I've heard tonight, I'm very comfortable with. I've followed the process for a while. I think it's a very thoughtful process. I think what the difficulty here is that we don't have a lot of space in the Short North, and the only way to address the parking challenges is to manage what we have better. And so what I really like about this plan is you're actually managing the space that we have better, and it's the smartest thing that we could possibly do. It's an urban solution for an urban neighborhood. And so I applaud your efforts very much. Thank you.
Well, thank everyone. I seriously want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope that you felt that this has been a productive part and piece of this conversation that we've been having and we will continue to have. Amanda, do you guys have any closing comments or in terms of next steps? We will take and meet and take the things that we heard this evening back and talk about, see what pieces and that we can work through. This is always going to be a moving target as we work together to make this process and make this community better and welcoming. So we really do appreciate it. What we bring to council there will also be another opportunity for community input when we bring it. So this is not to fix the ills of the past of one meeting where folks weren't able to speak, but I want folks to feel like you have ample opportunity to engage. Amanda, I think I appreciate how responsive she's been. I've been copied on a lot of the conversations, and even when we can't agree, it seems like we're getting back to folks, and we want to continue to have that type of a process. So I look forward to be a part of those conversations. I want to thank the team that's worked on this, thank the members of the community who have been engaged. I want to thank my staff, Zach Davidson, Linda Capobianco, Councilmember Page's team, Rolanda Hampton, and Sherry Martin, the Building and Zoning Services Department, as well as the Public Service Department for their work. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.